So I would say, honestly, if I had to say one thing, I would say it's been a real honor to be the district attorney serving the people in this county. It's been, I feel privileged to have had the chance to do that.
How is it that you came to decide that this was the position that you wanted?
So the history here is that a long, long time ago, I was in college, and then I was about to leave college. We were in Vietnam at the time, and my studies, frankly, I was not as attentive as I might have been. We were kind of a day-to-day thing. I got a draft notice to go. I a schedule for a physical, and then there was the TED offensive, and we pulled out, and it was a day-to-day thing. It was an interesting time to be alive, exciting time to be alive, but there wasn't something that I was really thinking in the future. And Dad was a lawyer. I don't know if you knew that. My dad was a lawyer, and he called me up one Friday and said, what are you doing? I said, I'm not doing anything. He said, well, why don't you go take your law boards tomorrow morning? I said, geez, Dad, don't be offended, but I don't really want to be a lawyer. And he says, well, what else are you doing? And I said, well, that's fair. So I got up in the morning. Today, you take courses and you study for months and you pay experts. And anyway, I walked in and I sat down and took the boards. I didn't do great, but I did well enough to get accepted to a couple of schools. And then I went and I was in heaven. I was over in Cape Cod, living in my parents' house, fixing up things. My summer job was, I was self-employed. I was waxing cars and fixing shingles and making enough money to go out at night, living on Cape Cod. And Dad called me up and he said, hey, I got a letter here from the law school, and can I open it? I said, sure. He said, well, you've been accepted. And I wasn't really ready to go to law school. I wasn't ready to leave this idyllic situation that I was in. And we pretty much had the same conversation. He said, look, I'll pay for your tuition. And honestly, it was a little bit of what else do you have to do? So I said, that's a fair comment. And who turns down a chance to go to law? I loved being in Boston. It was exotic. I met my wife there. She was a law student, and so I was in love, and I was in Boston, and I was studying law, and I really, I loved it. So while I was there, I did a little bit of student practicing. They had a process where a lot of law schools do, where as a third-year law student, you can go into court and do certain things. And I did that. That was in the criminal field. And so I came home, and I anticipated that I would be working with Dad. I mean, that was the idea, right? He put me through law school, and he had a law practice, and I think his dream was that we would practice together. And that was fine with me. And so I took the boards, the New York State boards, and we were waiting for the decision. And I got a call from somebody named Mike Cavanaugh. Well, I don't know who Mike Cavanaugh is. I've been away to law school for all these years. And it turns out Mike Cavanaugh is the new DA, and he invited me down for an interview. Now, and no one told me I was at a job interview. I just was going down to meet the DA, and I thought it was pretty savvy of him to reach out and talk to the new lawyers to be around the area. And so anyway, he offered me a job. I'm sitting where you are right now, and Mike is sitting over here, same desk, by the way, and he offered me a job, and here was my response. I looked back at this and laughed. I said, "Gee, I don't know. Do you mind if I ask my father?" No, I mean, if I was the DA, I'd say, "Forget it. I didn't mean to," right? But that's the perspective, and so I talked to Dad, and I said, "Gee, Mr. Cavanaugh offered me a job as an assistant DA," and he said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "I'm not sure. I thought that we would be practicing together." He said, "Do you want to be a trial attorney?" Dad was he did real estate and estate work and some contract stuff, things like that. He was not a trial attorney. Didn't care for that. And I said, "Yeah, I think I do." And he said, "Well, then you go to the DA's office. If you want to be a trial attorney, that's where you go to learn to be a trial attorney." So I started with Mike. That was my first full-time job. And gee, so much has changed then. I mean, we had a small office. We had 2 or 3 lawyers. We worked all the time. I lived in I don't know what you call it, maybe a shack. I mean, I lived in a house that had indoor plumbing, but no heat. I didn't have a telephone. I remember about a year into the job, Mike offered me a position as the chief assistant, and he said, do me a favor, for Christ's sakes, will you get a telephone? I said, okay, that's fair. So I was courting Denise at the time and working here as the chief assistant DA. My first salary, I hope you write this down, my first salary was $16,500, full-time job as an assistant DA. So I worked here with Mike, and I loved it. It was my boss was Mike Kavanaugh, and my other mentor was Frank Vogt. And I try and tell these young lawyers, I said, you don't understand, to come along and fall into a situation like that, where you have those kind of people as your mentors. I mean, it was just a gift, honestly. And we did a lot of work then. Things were different. We didn't have DNA. We didn't do a lot of things that we do today. Back then, the prosecutions were based primarily on witnesses, witness testimony, and we tried cases all the time. So I did that for a few years, and then I decided to go and practice with Dad. So I left as the chief assistant and worked with Dad. And as really, frankly, as a surprise to me, a guy named Paul Gruner, who I'd worked with very closely in this office, another one of my mentors, and he said, why don't you take a job with me as a part-time public defender? And I said, no way. I said, I'm not going to leave the DA's office and go work as a public defender. He says, well, why don't you try and see where it goes? And Denise and I were about to get married, and benefits and such were not a bad idea to have. And so I did that, and ended up staying for 20 years. As you may recall, that Paul was the public defender, Danny Gaffney and I, the three of us did all of the county court work that came down the pike. And I was, for one reason or another, I got most of the homicide cases. that seemed to be my shtick. And so over the years, I tried quite a few homicides. And so I had a couple of Freemans that are stacked up. And I'm looking through the Freemans. And the first one is, Vince Bradley has decided to run for district attorney. And then there were some other people that were kicking around. And the real shocker was that Williams had decided not to run. And I wasn't home for 2 hours before the phone started to ring. And people called up and said, hey, why don't you run for DA?